In this segment, we will study the pathway which is the internal pathway for apoptosis and which is known as the mitochondrial pathway for apoptosis. Initially, previously we studied the extrinsic के बाहर सेल के बाहर का जो pathway वो क्या है. Now the cell has itself a mechanism incorporated internally for the apoptosis. Now cells can activate their apoptosis program, जो इनका death program है, from inside the cell, often in response किस तरह stresses किस तरह की, such as DNA damage, जबकि DNA damage हो जाए, or in response to the developmental signals, that there are some developmental signals which are faulty or cells cannot carry out those developmental signals, so the cell internally incorporate its apoptosis program. Now, in the vertebrate cells, these responses are governed by the intrinsic or mitochondrial pathway. पहले हमने extrinsic pathway पढ़ा. Now there is intrinsic pathway, that is the inside the cell, which is due to the mitochondria of the cell and known as the mitochondrial pathway of apoptosis. Now this depends on the release into the cytosol of mitochondrial proteins that normally reside in the intermembrane space of the organelle. Mitochondrial के जो intermembrane space हैं, उनमें ये proteins exist करती हैं and cell releases it. For example, in this simple diagram of mitochondria is there is outer membrane, there is crystal space, inner membrane, and intermembrane spaces, and then there is a matrix spaces. And the proteins, they are attached there, and then the mitochondria releases this. Now, some of the release proteins, जो हैं, वो क्या हैं? They activate a capsaicin proteolytic cascade in the cytoplasm, which lead to the apoptosis. Cascade mean from one stage to second to third and eventually to the apoptosis. Now, a key protein in the intrinsic pathway is known as a cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is a water-soluble component of the mitochondrial electron transport chain and is well known, we all know there. Now, when this cytochrome C is released in the cytosol, it takes a new function. पहले तो ये electron transport chain में है, लेकिन when it is released in the cytosol में जब release हो जाती है from the membrane, it takes on a new function and activating the capsaicin 9 molecule. Remember, the capsaicin molecule are very important in degrading those enzymes. Now, capsaicin 9 molecules क्या करते हैं? Then activate downstream executioner capsaicin. जो executioner capsaicin है, उनको ये activate कर देते हैं and they induce the apoptosis, which eventually cell में apoptosis जो वो है, वो induce हो जाता है. This thing is indicated in this cartoon, where the intrinsic pathway of apoptosis is being demonstrated, where there is a mitochondria, cytochrome C is released there, and eventually it just deactivates the other proteins, and then it degrades the cell altogether so that the capsaicin, they become activated and the cell death occurs. Now, another protein, that is the BCL2 proteins, they, as a matter of fact, regulate the intrinsic pathway of apoptosis. एपोटासिस का इंट्रिंसिक पाथवे जो कि माइटोकॉन्ड्रिया से शुरू होता है, इसको कंट्रोल करता है BCL2 प्रोटीन्स, एंड द इंट्रिंसिक पाथवे ऑफ एपोटासिस इज टाइटली रेगुलेटेड, बहुत टाइटली रेगुलेट होता है. क्यों? टू इंश्योर दैट सेल्स किल देमसेल्व्स ओनली व्हेन इट इज़ अप्रोप्रिएट. ये नहीं कि खाम खाई ये सेल्स को डाई करता रहे. Only BCL2 proteins are there which make sure that cell death occurs only when it is needed. A major class of intracellular regulator of intrinsic pathway, that is the BCL2 family of the protein, and the mammalian BCL2 family protein, they regulate the intrinsic pathway of apoptosis mainly by controlling the release of cytochrome C. Remember, we discussed earlier that cytochrome C is in the mammal side and other intermembrane mitochondrial proteins in the cytosol, and this is how the intrinsic pathway of the apoptosis is controlled.